So today, the reason I said this is a special research spotlight is that our speaker is Megan Sullivan. And for those of you who have attended Research Spotlight talks over the last 2 years, you will know that Megan has been the Research Spotlight assistant and the on-camera host of our Research Spotlight series for the last 2 years. We're flipping the script a little bit this time around, and Megan is going to be giving the talk about her own doctoral research. And I get the honors of being the host in this case, which I'm very happy about. Megan will be graduating this spring with a PhD from the Yale School of the Environment. And as a tropical ecologist, she's broadly interested in the diversity and dynamics of tropical ecosystems, particularly exploring how disturbance and environmental changes can alter tropical forest structure and function. Megan's looking forward to continuing her work as a tropical ecologist in Africa in the future, first as a Fulbright scholar in Rwanda, and also as a postdoctoral research associate at the High Meadows Environmental Institute at Princeton University. Great things there. So before graduate school, she worked on ecological and conservation-focused research in Central Africa, Central and South America, Southwestern China, and in the United States, Arizona, and Ohio. She earned a bachelor's degree in evolution, ecology, and organismal biology from Ohio State University in 2014, and also studied botanical illustration prior to working in research and academia. So I would like to invite Megan Sullivan to turn your camera on, and hopefully you'll be able to do that. There you go. It's so great to have you here today in this role, Megan. And I wanted to just take a moment while you are on camera as well here to say thank you for 2 phenomenal years of hosting and coordinating the Research Spotlight series. You did a tremendous job with this. Some of you will have seen some of Megan's other work with the Peabody. If you live around New Haven and ever went to the Blue State coffee shop on Orange Street, Megan and another grad student colleague, Sydney Muchnick, were part of developing photograph exhibits for the walls of the Blue State coffee shop, which were also fantastic. And Megan has been part of our Science Cafe program, which since COVID has been on Zoom. Before that, it was at Bar downtown. Hopefully we'll be able to bring that back. But anyway, Megan, you've been a huge part of our programming at the Peabody for the last couple of years. And I congratulate you on finishing here with your PhD and moving on to great things. We're going to miss you tremendously. But before you go, we get to hear about your research finally. And I'm really, really glad about that. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Megan, and let us know what you've been working on.
Okay, thanks, David. Thank you so much for that great introduction. I've had such a great time working with the Peabody over the past couple of years, and it's just been a really great way to stay engaged with Yale and, to get, a way to interact with people in different departments, with a public audience. I've had a lot of fun in this position, so I'm really glad to end my time in the Research Spotlight assistant role with my own presentation of my own research after introducing so many other graduate students here. I'm just going to share my slides now. And hopefully you all can see the full screen version of this. So as David mentioned, I'm Megan Sullivan, and I am here to present to you today just some parts of what I've done for my PhD research. And my research has focused on selective logging as a compromise for sustainable forest management. So selective logging is something that's super interesting to me. And this is because tropical forests globally are increasingly under threat due to some profit-generating land uses. And selective logging is often something that is hailed as a type of compromise in terms of land use. So it generates income, but it doesn't completely clear forests from the land. And across the forest landscape, canopy cover remains largely intact. Now, just in case you're not super familiar with the process of selective logging, I'm going to quickly go through it for you here. If you are someone who wants to log a forest, you would start by going into a forest with a lot of big, tall trees. You're then going to go through the forest and look for timber species. So you're going to inventory the forest and note the locations of trees that are of the selected species and sizes that you would like to cut. And you can use that information about where those timber species are to go in and clear roads and build infrastructure to support your logging operations. After that, you'll cut down your selected timber trees. And after all of those trees are cut, you can move on to cutting a different area of forest. Cut forests must be left undisturbed for a certain amount of time before cutting again, up to 40 years. So 25 to 40 years is sort of the average variation there in a lot of tropical ecosystems. And that variation depends on which particular species you're cutting, because different species have different regeneration requirements in terms of the amount of time you have to wait. But if you do wait the appropriate amount of time, you should be able to go back into that forest later and cut your selected timber species again once they have regrown. Now, there are some variable impacts in terms of selective logging throughout the tropics. Researchers have noted that there can be positive, negative, and neutral impacts from selective logging. And some of the differences in these impacts can be resulting from differences in the logging practices and logging intensities across the different regions of the tropics. Again, regional differences, and there can also be some differences between particular logging operators and their logging protocols within a given region. And so I'm just going to give you a quick example of this right here. This table shows average tree removal under a low intensity selective logging regime per region in the tropics. So if you look at the average tree removal in Africa, you have that as 0.6 to 2 trees per hectare, which, if you don't know how much a hectare is, it's about 2.5 football fields. So that might be able to help you put that into context a little bit. In South America, you have an average tree removal rate at 5 to 6 trees per hectare. And in Asia, you have an average tree removal rate at 8 trees per hectare. And so you can see that the impacts of low intensity selective logging could be highly variable simply because we're referring to, in this one category, low intensity selective logging, a different level of quantitative impact on systems. If you're cutting 2 trees per hectare, you might expect that to have a much lower impact than if you're cutting 8 trees per hectare. So this is one of the reasons why it's really important to quantify logging and what the logging intensity is when you're doing these studies on the ecological impact of selective logging. Now, even in a forest with a quantitatively low level of selective logging, we will see some changes in the selectively logged forest. That's just what happens when you go into a forest with machines and cut down trees. And some of these changes will be temporally variable. So we'll likely see the biggest impacts during and immediately after logging, but some changes may be persistent. So they'll last for several years after logging and affect the ecosystem, or we could see some lagged effects. So things that don't pop up until many years after the forest has started to recover from logging. And so a lot of these changes can be in the abiotic environment. So things like canopy openness and light. Again, when the logging activities are occurring, the cutting down of trees and opening up of skid trails. Skid trails are just the routes that machines take into the forest to pull the trees back up to the road where they are taken by trucks by the logging concession to be processed. And both of these logging activities open up the forest canopy. So here you can see a canopy opening from a tree gap, and these openings let in a lot more light to the normally shady forest understory. And this is the most sort of direct impact you might think that you would see from selective logging. We also have some indirect impacts that logging can have on ecosystems. So logging can affect animal communities and animal movement and behavior patterns. One of the reasons for this is that the logging noise and human presence from logging activities can scare animals away from logged areas. They might be avoiding those areas during logging and for some time after. But then also those open skid trails that persist in the understory open up the understory and might make the area more attractive for large mammals to move around in. And I have a photo for this for you. So on the left here, I have a photo of a skid trail. Again, this is where these machines have passed to bring the cut timber species back up to the road. And you can see this is a very wide area. You could probably walk several people in a horizontal line down this skid trail, and you'd have a lot of room to move around. Whereas on the right, you have a photo of an animal trail. And this is this curving sort of brownish trail right here, leading up to a fruiting tree that elephants really like. It's called wild African mango. And as you can see, the skid trails are much larger than animal trails, but when animals are navigating a very closed and dense forest understory, they have to make these trails themselves. So if you have these big open areas in these selectively logged forests, that might be a really attractive area that animals might want to spend more time in when the forest is recovering from logging. So as we discussed earlier, some of these changes will happen, and these changes can impact forest composition. So the types of trees that are regenerating after logging occurs. And one of the things that can impact which type of trees are regenerating is the removal of these timber species. And this could lead to a lower timber species regeneration because fewer adult-sized timber trees that are seed sources would be in the forest canopy. Also, the tree fall gaps and skid trails that open up the forest and clear the forest understory cause some environmental differences that could confer a competitive advantage to species whose seedlings and saplings are able to survive and compete well under the abiotic conditions of the logged forest with higher light and forest understories that might be drier and hotter. And the types of species that would really benefit from these environmental shifts are fast-growing, light-demanding, drought-tolerant pioneers or long-lived pioneer species that tend to have lower wood density and typically also tend to have smaller seeds that are abiotically dispersed. So abiotic dispersal would be something like wind dispersal, as in maple seeds, instead of animal dispersal, where animals eat the seeds and then spit them out or defecate them away from the tree that they got that fruit from. Additionally, the logging noise and the human presence can scare away animals, as I said before, which is another reason that the regeneration of animal dispersed species could be reduced in recently logged forests. So based on all these factors, my research coalesced around this question: how does very low intensity selective logging impact the environment immediately after selective logging? And do these changes continue to impact the forest over time? Because for selective logging to succeed as a compromise that allows land use for economic development while minimizing the negative impacts on the environment, we can't only look at the direct impacts of logging on large trees immediately after timber is cut. We also have to look at how these forests are recovering over time and through different plant life stages. So in order to study this, I went to Gabon to do my dissertation work. Gabon is a country on the west coast of Central Africa, and it's well known for its wildlife, its abundance of forests, and its many national parks and protected areas. Gabon is the second most forested country in the world, which you can see on this map. It has almost 90% forest cover, which is all of the green colored areas in the background, which makes it an excellent place to study forest ecology. Now, the yellow outlined areas here are all of the country's protected areas, and everything outlined in red is forest that's leased to a logging concession. So not quite the entirety of forest areas outside of protected areas, but logging permits do cover 60% of the land area of Gabon, which is a pretty sizable chunk. Now, selective logging is obviously currently hugely affecting much of Gabon's forests, but I do want to note that in Gabon, logging started in the 1800s, and this high level of forest cover has been maintained ever since then. So it does seem like Gabon has been doing something right in terms of sustainable forest management. For my dissertation research, I really wanted to investigate the types of forest management that were happening in Gabon a little bit further. So I chose a logging concession to work in yellow on this map. And I set up these vegetation plots, so all of these different colored dots across this logging concession to look at the impacts of selective logging. And because I said before that it's important to quantify the rate of logging that occurs when you do these types of studies, I want to note that the rate of tree removal in this particular logging concession is at 0.8 to 1.6 trees removed per hectare, which is within that average range of tree removal that you would expect to see in African forests. And to set up this study, I went into the logging concession and set up 80 plots. So each of these dots represents one vegetation plot on this map. And we set up these vegetation plots across 4 blocks and 3 different treatments. So we have this purple treatment right here. That's a 1 year since logging treatment. We have this blue treatment. That's a 10 years since logging treatment. And then we have 2 different control areas, which are just different areas of unlogged forest in the concession. And in each vegetation plot, so over here, we measured seedlings in each of the yellow subplots, saplings in each of the green subplots, and adults in the entirety of the vegetation plot. And in total, in our initial vegetation census, we measured 10,125 trees and 1,394 lianas. I also compiled information from databases on functional traits, timber species, and growth form. So these would be things like wood density, life history strategy, that's whether a tree species was light demanding versus shade tolerant. I also looked at dispersal type, so whether the tree was animal versus abiotic dispersed, and if the tree was a timber or a non-timber species, and that information was based on the particular species that this logging concession was actually targeting in these areas that we measured. And we had a few hypotheses about how forests that have undergone low intensity selective logging would look like after they've been logged. So first, we expected that differences in species composition across logging treatments would be different due to increased environmental changes in log forests. We also expected to see some shifts in some key functional traits, so lower wood density and more light demanding species. And we expected this to be due to the higher light levels in the understory of log forests, where these fast growing light wooded species would have a competitive advantage. We also expected there to be fewer animal dispersed species in the understory of log forests. First of all, because animal dispersal is typically thought of as a trait that is associated with these dense wooded, slow growing shade tolerant species, and also because animals may be negatively impacted by logging activities when logging is occurring and immediately after, so this could reduce animal dispersal in log forests. And finally, we expected there to be fewer timber species in the log forest understory. And we expected that this would be simply due to the removal of adult timber trees that acted as seed sources. And after we collected all this data and did all these analyses, we found some of the answers to these questions and hypotheses that we had. So first of all, we found that there were some composition differences that were most obvious in the understory of the older log forests. And we can see this by looking at these figures here. So these represent seedling, sapling, and adult species composition. So looking at what species are in each of these life stages across the 3 different forest treatments. And the different colored volumes in all these figures represent the species composition. And so more overlap between these volumes means the species composition was more similar, and less overlap means the species composition was more different. And so if you can see in this middle panel here, the 10 years since logged forest volume in this blue color sits a little bit to the side of the unlogged control forest and the 1 year since logged forest, meaning that it's more different than those two that are slightly overlapping. And so then we wanted to look at, what do these composition differences mean in terms of how ecological services or forest function might also be shifting after selective logging occurs. For functional traits, we first looked at mean wood density, and we found that seedlings and saplings in older log forests had higher plot level mean wood density. So this is the blue box here and here in the 10-year-old forest than in the unlogged forest. So unlogged forest is the teal box here and here. And so it appears that this type of very low intensity selective logging does not negatively impact these high wood density species, which is good when you're considering the carbon storage potential of these forests and what types of species are going to be regenerating and shaping what the forest looks like in the future. Next, we found that saplings in older log forests here had higher proportions of stems of light-demanding species per plot than in unlogged forests. And this was a really interesting result because sometimes light-demanding species are pioneer species. So these really light-wooded species that grow quickly and also die very quickly. This is one example of such a species called Musanga sacropoides. But there are another type of light-demanding species that I mentioned before, these long-lived pioneer species. And one example of a long-lived pioneer species is actually Ocumea kleiniana, which is one of the most commonly logged species in this particular logging concession and across many logging concessions in Gabon. And these long-lived pioneers are a bit different because they require a lot of light in early life stages, but they can survive and persist longer than pioneer species, and they have higher wood densities than those strict pioneers. And so an increase in the proportions of light-demanding species could actually have some benefits just depending on which species are driving this pattern. And another thing that this result indicated to us was that the trade-offs between life history strategy and wood density may be a little bit more complex than we were initially considering. And by further exploring these relationships and figuring out how those traits relate to each other, that can enable us to better predict how these types of forest functions are impacted by disturbance. Next, we found that saplings in older logged forests, so again, this blue box here, had higher proportions of stems of animal-dispersed species per plot than in unlogged forests. And what this suggested to us is that animal-dispersed species do not have a competitive disadvantage, and that animal dispersal processes may not be negatively impacted by the selective logging activities at our site, at least in the longer term recovery of the forest. And additionally, what this means is that the potential food availability for animals in the future of forest does not appear to be negatively impacted. So these animal dispersed trees, they produce seeds and fruit that animals eat. And so it's a good thing that these things are regenerating and coming up in higher proportions in the sapling community. Hopefully we see those things continue to grow and survive into the canopy community, where those saplings will be able to become large trees, which will provide fruit for animals to eat into the future. Finally, we found one kind of concerning result. So seedlings in recently logged forests, so this purple block here, and adults in older logged forests, this blue block here, had lower proportions of stems of timber species per plot than in unlogged forests, so compared to the teal in each panel of this figure. And this implies that the regeneration of timber species is happening at lower rates than non-timber species in this logging concession. And so this may be concerning for the future economic sustainability of forestry operations. If timber species regeneration declines after each logging cycle, the timber species that are targeted in this region may become depleted over time. Now, on what timescale this is going to play out is a little bit unclear. Our study only looked at forests that were up to 10 years into the recovery process. And since these trees take some time to grow and just grow into the size that is a canopy-sized tree in these forests, we would have to conduct studies on longer timescales to see how these timber species regeneration dynamics are playing out. So in conclusion, we found that selectively logged forest had small differences in community composition. And when we looked to characterize what these differences meant for forest function and ecosystem services, we found that there's this sort of lagged signature of selective logging. So it comes up in the 10 years old forest and was most prevalent in the understory, especially in the saplings, is where we saw a lot of the results. And what that functional signature looked like was trees of higher mean wood density, fewer light demanding species, more animal dispersed species, and fewer timber species. And so overall, it appears that this particular type of very low intensity selective logging does not negatively impact some important ecosystem services, such as considering the carbon storage potential of these log forests when looking at the mean wood density of regenerating species, or when looking at animal seed dispersal and fruit availability for animals when looking at those animal dispersed species. And timber species regeneration was less prevalent in logged forests. So again, this was the major sort of concerning result here. And there are some different management protocols that you can implement in order to spur timber species regeneration that have a lot of research behind them. So things like ensuring that canopy gap sizes meet the light requirements of those timber species that demand a lot of light, or a more intensive management protocol would be enrichment planting. So that's where you take seedlings of timber species and actually plant them in the forest to replace the timber species that you've cut down. And I just wanted to zoom out a little bit here and talk about, what these results mean more broadly when you're thinking about selective logging as a compromise, and if these results are applicable in different contexts or in different regions. Now, considering the management strategies that are in place in particular concessions that you're studying is really important, and adopting management protocols that prioritize very low intensity logging and also protecting the animal communities in these forests against hunting are really key strategies that can help minimize the negative impacts to the forest ecosystem. And those two things, this low timber removal and strategies to protect animal communities, those things were implemented in our logging concession that we studied. And so I would encourage anyone that wants to, apply these results to other logging companies. Those are two management strategies in particular that you should really look at. Also, when considering the regional context, and if these results would be similar across other regions or countries, I just want to highlight that Gabon is a really unique country, and our study provides evidence that this very low intensity selective logging in a Congo Basin forest in a country with overall very high forest cover can have limited negative impacts on this ecosystem. But again, the combination of high forest cover and low logging levels is fairly unique to this particular region. And so how each of those two metrics are similar or different in other regions should be considered when you're thinking about if selective logging would be a good compromise land management strategy. Now, another thing that can vary between countries and regions is monitoring and enforcement of forestry code and practices. And in any industry, there can be good and bad actors. So monitoring companies to ensure that legal limits of timber removal are respected and that logging concessions are following established guidelines, such as any hunting restrictions. Those things are pretty important because ignoring those limits and guidelines would likely cause more negative impacts than the ones that we found in our study. And then finally, there's an opportunity to implement some potential management solutions that could perhaps counteract some of the more concerning results that we found, which were concerning timber species regeneration. Again, there are different types of protocols that are sort of more or less management intense. They take more time and money on the side of the logging company and those managers that would have to implement those protocols. And so an area that would be really good to research would be what the actual return on investment is for each of those different protocols to help the logging concessions that want to increase timber species regeneration to make the best decisions for their business to ensure the long-term sustainability of timber in these forests. And so I'd just like to thank everyone that, played a role in all of this research. I had an amazing field team. I worked with master's student interns from the National School of Water and Forests in Gabon. I work with many botanical experts from the National Herbarium of Gabon, a lot of logistic support from the national parks, and of course from my PhD advisors. And I also had a lot of institutions that helped with funding support. And so I just wanted to thank everyone involved. And I also wanted to thank everyone at the Peabody for allowing me to, be involved and engaged in this position while I was doing all of this work. It was just such a great way to connect with everyone at Yale. Thank you.
Fantastic, Megan. Thanks so much for sharing that wonderful set of images and field work and research with us. It is fantastic to see what you've been involved in over the past many years here, in addition to running the Research Spotlight series for the Peabody, of course. It's just tremendous. You quantified a lot of trees. Wow, it's just remarkable. How many field seasons were you in Gabon?
Yeah, so I started this work in late 2018 and did our first census in between 2018 to 2019. So that took almost till the end of the year of 2019. And during that time, I was in Gabon for a year and a half. And then just this past year in 2022, I spent 8 months in Gabon doing a recensus of all the vegetation plots, which I didn't present any of that information here. But it's just a lot to go through. So I thought this was sort of the most interesting stuff that I could present here today. So
yeah. And so what you presented today represented about a year and a half of field work in Gabon. Yep. Wow, yep. Fantastic. Exactly. Yeah, and also the trees you showed, not only in the first slide, but there were a couple of other places where you showed some trees that looked to me to be huge. I don't know if those mature trees were 40 years old, as you say, sort of regenerated trees, or if those in some cases were much older. What the size of the trees we were looking at, what age were we looking at for the most part?
I would have to look at some of those particular pictures that you're talking about. I would say some of those trees are pretty old. Normally, the size that they are thinking about cutting is somewhere between 60 and 70 centimeters DBH. So that's like if you put your arms out, I know everyone's arms are a little bit different lengths, but you know, it would be bigger than you could put your arms around, certainly.
Yeah.
And the age of trees isn't exactly correlated to, I mean, you know, the older a tree gets, the bigger it gets, but there's a lot of between species variation in sort of how fast they grow and how thick they get, especially in the tropics. It's hard to understand that because you can't do, you can't look at the species or the growth rings. Like, I don't know if you've ever heard of people looking at growth rings in
Yes.
trees in temperate regions, but since the tropics don't have, you know, a clearly defined growing season separated by a winter, those tree rings aren't as defined, and it's a little bit more difficult to figure out the ages of the different sizes of trees.
Oh, that's really interesting. I didn't realize that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's all based on
Okay.
like spring, winter. That's what makes those,
Okay.
you know, really, really different tree rings in the trees that we think of in, you know, the Northern Hemisphere.
Yeah. All right. Good to know that. So we've got a number of questions that have come in from our attendees here. So I'm going to just dive right into a couple of those, if that's all right. Beverly asked, any data on animal species such as bird species surveys, butterflies, primates in selectively logged versus control forest?
So I did not do any of these species in my particular lot, or any of these surveys of animals in my particular logging concessions. There are other people from different like university research programs and organizations that have come in and done surveys of sort of particular different taxa. So there's some people from like the Max Planck Institute in Germany that came and did like great ape surveys and things like that. And there's been a lot of people doing impact assessment surveys because they're thinking of putting a hydroelectric dam in part of the area of this logging concession in the future. And so there are other people that have done these studies. They weren't, you know, organized in the particular like logging block spatial differentiated area as I did them. But there are a lot of animal species in this concession. When I was there, I saw chimps, mandrills, elephants, lots of, you know, different types of deer of all shapes and sizes, many different kinds of little monkeys. It was a very exciting place to do field work. Very fun. Yeah.
All right. Thanks. So yeah, a really varied set of questions here. So I'm going to jump right into something else. Hal asks, were there historic air photos of the forest tracts?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question because, yeah, it would be really interesting to be able to look at aerial photos and compare, you know, what the forest used to look like versus what the forest looks like now. I know there's a lot of people that do research with either satellite images or drones to look at the, you know, differences over time so that you can tell how much a forest is being disturbed and things like that. But yeah, I don't have that information. So it would be really cool to get though.
Yeah, no doubt. Thanks. All right. Why the difference in average trees removed per hectare in the different areas of the world? Is it species? Is it density of the forest? Politics?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think perhaps, you know, in Central Africa, it was maybe, I don't know, a little bit more difficult to get trees out of the forest. And maybe you didn't need to cut as many trees to, you know, sort of make a little bit of a profit. I know, especially just seeing some of the stuff about like the development of land around forest areas, like in Southeast Asia, there have been a lot more intense like land use developments. Like there's a lot of agricultural development. For example, I think oil palm is one of those things that a lot of people know about and associate with like Southeast Asia. And so there's just usually a lot more, intense development in that region. But yeah, it's just, I think, really important to think about, how that, mindset, I guess, if you're coming from those places and have that mindset in mind, how that would affect different regions if you're bringing people from different regions to log different places. For example, a lot of companies from Southeast Asia now are coming into African forests and starting to log them. And I think it's really interesting when you're thinking about, the difference in logging practices. If those people are coming in and bringing sort of their normal forestry practices to Central Africa, the impact on forests could be really different. And yeah, that would change how like selective logging impacts the environment across these different type of forests.
Got it. Fantastic. That's really interesting. Would you mind actually stopping your screen share for the last couple of questions
sure.
here? Thank you. It's great. So we've got a question here from Monica. Do timber species as a whole generally share similar functional traits? And are they particularly important for any single group of animals?
So this is really interesting because this is something that I think a lot of the research that I've read has either assumed or said, because they've been looking at like different timber species in a different region, that timber species tend to be like hardwooded, slow growing animal dispersed species. And I think in this particular forest ecosystem, that's just not what we found when we were looking at the timber species. So if you look at like the most commonly logged species, like the first 6 on the timber species list, you have 3 animal dispersed and 3 abiotic dispersed.
Wow. Okay.
And then, and then, like I said, some of those timber species are the pioneer species, but not the strict pioneers, the long-lived pioneer species. So they require a lot of light at the beginning and they can sort of grow really fast then, but then they do stick around for a longer amount of time in the forest canopy than like some of those strict pioneers like the musanga that really die off pretty quickly after they've initially established and formed that like first layer of canopy cover. So I think that doing that chapter was really interesting to me because it was just, it showed me how much of what I knew or like expected was coming from some different studies in some different places. And I really needed to adjust my expectations to look at what was actually going on in the forest that I studied, which seemed to be just a little bit different than what the forest that a lot of other people had studied.
Yeah, no doubt. Interesting. All right, so we've got just a couple more questions for you, if you don't mind, Megan. Sure. So Sydney is curious about the rules used to decide which trees to cut down in selective logging. In other words, how are those decided? Could they be adjusted to achieve the level of logging that you found to be minimally impactful?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, so this is about the rules used to decide which trees are chosen to be cut down. How are those trees decided, and could the rules be adjusted to achieve a minimally impactful level of logging?
I see. I think that so there are rules about which species you can't cut based on if they are protected species that are endangered, so they're not present in like really high numbers across the forest. And some of those trees people have cut in the past and have used for timber or like, various like making really fancy like woodworking type of things. And those species, so again, could be cut for timber, but because they're sort of targeted, it would be important to not decimate those populations from the forest. So now they are protected. And so I think some of those limitations are based on things like that. And then I think a lot of just why trees are chosen are for, their particular qualities. Like I said, there are some trees that are hardwooded that are really good for, construction, making furniture, things like that. There are other species that are more soft-wooded, like that okume, the Okume kleiniana that I mentioned. That's a really common timber species in Gabon, and that's actually used more for like making plywood and things like that. So there are all sorts of different reasons, why you would cut certain timber species. And in this particular forest, a lot of the timber species happen to be more soft-wooded species.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Interesting. And so the last question is one of mine. I was saving this. It's really great to see that, one of your results is that ecosystem services were not negatively impacted or not very negatively impacted by this really sort of low level of selective logging. But on the other side, is that low level of selective logging enough to sustain the forestry industry there and to supply the need for timber that exists?
Well, so that average logging rate, I think that's been common in African forests for a really long time.
Okay.
So I would say that just based on that, I would assume that it's enough to, allow companies to be like solvent and make a profit and things like that. In terms of, meeting the global demand of wood, like I said, in different regions, there's a lot of different species that people target for different particular reasons. And I don't think you could, just focus on any one region of the world and meet all of those needs. I think you probably need many different, logging operations in many different places to meet those needs. There's also, a lot of different kinds of logging and ways of producing wood. So, you have forests like in Norway or something like that, where they're plantation forests, where they're actually planting trees and growing them up. Or I think we have those, like in the southeastern US. So there's a lot of different ways that we produce and can get wood for all of the different, needs that people have for it. And I think, having a lot of different ways that you do get these different types of wood for these different needs is probably, what you need to have a sustainable industry overall. Like you wouldn't want to throw all your eggs in one basket and say, this is the only solution. So I think, with all of the other asterisks that I had on this slide about how sustainable forest management could be a selective logging strategy in like a particular place, there are other things that would work better in different places. And that's why I sort of really drilled home in the last slide about, you need to consider the region, you need to consider the context, and you need to consider, what you're providing and what you're trying to get out of that. Definitely multi-pronged solutions are way better than one size fits all solutions. So that's what I would say in response to that question.
Got it. Sure. And it sounds like then most of the timber harvested there is probably leaving that region to go elsewhere around the world. Is that right?
A lot of it is, so the market, basically there's a lot of certified timber that's cut that's going to like Europe or perhaps the United States. If you're an uncertified logging concession, which Gabon is in the process of having all of their logging concessions become certified, but currently, I think there's still some uncertified ones, but at least in the Central African region, I think it's more common for those uncertified timber to be sold to places like India, China, other nations in Africa that are willing to, they don't necessarily want a certification. They would rather pay the lower cost for uncertified or like unsustainable wood. So yeah, again, there's sort of different things that are driving the market and these different sales of wood globally. But they did, I will say they have added sort of different processing requirements. So you can't export whole bowls of wood like the entire tree. The wood has to be cut and processed to a certain extent before it leaves the country, which was something that was implemented around 2010. And that was in an effort to, increase the amount of jobs that the forestry industry had in Gabon, and just make sure that, there are other opportunities for skilled labor in this industry.
Great. All right. Well, Megan, thank you. It was really fantastic to finally be able to hear more about your own work. After,
Thanks,
as
David.
you say, you've spent so much time talking with other graduate students here at Yale about their work as our research spotlight assistant and host. So I want to thank you today for your talk, and I want to thank the audience for being here. And I also want to thank you again, as I did at the beginning, and for those who might have joined since then, for 2 phenomenal years of work with us at the Peabody. And we're going to miss you, but as we said at the beginning, you're moving on to some wonderful things. And at some point soon, I think you'll be at Princeton, which isn't too far away. So I hope you'll make sure to come visit, and it'll be great to see where your research takes you next. So thanks again, Megan.
Thank you, David. Yeah, it's been such a pleasure. I really appreciate everyone who came today. And yeah, thanks for letting me be the research spotlight assistant for the past 2 years.
Indeed. All right. Take care, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.